What is up, guys? I hope all is well. So as some of you guys requested, we're going to start doing a little bit more of the research breakdown side of things, just because I think, we read a lot of research and a lot of it can take a lot of time. So what we want to do is essentially give you really quick breakdowns of the take-home points of, important studies that maybe inform our field, and so that you guys can kind of keep up to date with what's going on and what really is, the evidence-based information. So hopefully you guys have enough trust in us to be able to give you that information well. And we don't need to, there's a lot of research reviews out there, and sometimes the research reviews that you read are almost as long as the studies themselves. So I thought that maybe just doing it in the video format, very quickly giving you the main, important details of the study would be a really good way of going about this. So yeah, let's get the ball rolling. So some of you may have seen this study thrown around on social media. It was the DIETFITS study, and essentially what they were looking at is the difference between a healthy low-fat diet and a healthy low-carbohydrate diet. And they've got that word healthy in there because one of their big focuses was to not have, the difference in, food quality or diet quality as one of the confounding variables in interpreting the results, because that's one of the things that you see quite a bit when it comes to epidemiological research or observational research. Like if you were to look at like the overall population of people who were trying to have a low fat diet, they tend to choose like crappy enough foods a lot of the time, whereas the low carb group, they kind of end up eating more vegetables, more protein, and that sort of stuff kind of happens sometimes in practice. So that can be a confounding variable. So they control for that quite well. So essentially, to kind of start at the starting point, there were 609 people. They were overweight, healthy, so they would be excluded from the study if they had, diseases. So if they had metabolic disease or diabetes, cancer, those sorts of things. They were pregnant, lactating, things that could essentially confound the results. And that's a pretty important thing to do, because then you're not, you're looking at a study that is applicable to healthy people, because they're the people we're typically talking about when we talk about this whole health and fitness thing. So that's what they did. 609 participants. They were all overweight, and essentially what they wanted to look at was one, who lost more weight over a 12-month period, the healthy low-fat group or the healthy low-carbohydrate group. So that was one of the big objectives, but they also had the objective of looking at whether baseline levels of insulin in response to an oral glucose tolerance test, which essentially means that the subjects had 75 grams of glucose administered, and they looked at the amount of insulin that was secreted after 30 minutes. So, they'd put them into a high, middle, and low insulin group then from there. So they just look at how those things impacted the results. So that was their second kind of hypothesis, was that maybe that insulin secretion would predict weight loss outcomes. And then the third one was in relation to genotype, so your actual kind of genetics. So people always talk about how some people are more suited to a low carb diet, some people are more suited to a low fat diet, and there are certain like combinations of genetic variables, so SNPs or single nucleotide polymorphisms, that people kind of look at and say that, all right, this predicts that you'll do well on a low fat diet, or this predicts that you'll do well on a low carbohydrate diet. So what they did in this study was like analyze like over 800,000 of these SNPs, and that they grouped them into the 3 SNPs that were predictive of each of those things. So whether you do better on a healthy low fat group and healthy low carbohydrate group. So what they've got is they've got an idea of who might do well according to the whole insulin secretion hypothesis, and who might do well according to the whole genotype hypothesis. So they've got that before they even start the study. So from there, what they're doing is essentially looking at weight loss. Like that was the primary thing they were looking at, but they were also analyzing for those variables afterwards. So after the 12-month period, so the study was carried out over 12 months, what they saw was that there was little to no difference, or statistically insignificant difference, between the groups in terms of weight loss. So the healthy low carbohydrate group lost 6 kilos, and the healthy low fat group lost 5.3 kilos. And that's not actually, like, that might look like an important difference to you, but over the course of a year, 700 grams difference in weight loss between groups isn't actually that meaningful, especially when we consider that, the healthy low fat group had a lot more carbohydrates in their diet, over double, And as a result, that can lead to additional glycogen storage and water storage that could be impacting those results. So that's important to keep in mind. So to take it back a step, one of the cool things about this study was that it was really based on dietary education. So what they did at the start of the study was encouraged both groups to reduce the respective macronutrients, so whether it was fat or carbohydrates, down to 20 grams if they could. So they wanted to get them to eat as low as they possibly could. They called it like a limbo titrate protocol. So the limbo idea being that you go as low as you can go. So go as low as you can go with either fat or carbohydrates, and then stay there for a couple of weeks, and then add 5 to 15 grams per week in order to get back to a level that is comfortable and sustainable for you. Okay, and one of the big arguments often is that low carbohydrate diets are more sustainable, and that people find it easier to stay at very low levels of carbohydrates because they have less appetite or whatever. There's various hypotheses, but when you look at this study, that actually wasn't the case. So neither group got down to like the 20 gram level, like maybe on an individual basis, but across the group, like the low fat group got down to around 47 grams at like 3 months, and the low carbohydrate group were able to get down to 96 grams at 3 months. So really nowhere close to the desired 20 gram level. Okay, so neither groups were able to get down there. But the low carbohydrate group then, over the trajectory of, they measured at 3, 6, and 12 months. So at 6 months, they increased to like 113 grams. And then at 12 months, they went up to 132 grams, if my memory serves me. So back up to 132 grams. So as you can see, we're pretty far away from that 20 gram level that was actually recommended. And in the low fat group, they started at 47, as I said, and then I think they went to like 54 and 57. I know they were in the 50s. So as you can see, like they were able to keep it down there versus like the 87 that they initially started with. So at their baseline intake was 87 grams of fat. So, a very easy way to reduce calories quite a bit. And then the low carb group, their initial baseline was something around 240 to 250 grams. And then at the end, they were 132 grams. So neither group were able to kind of keep it at that 20 gram level, but that wasn't the intention of the study either. It was purely based on kind of education, go as low as you can go, and then come back to a point that is comfortable for you. The cool thing is that regardless of whether it was healthy low fat or healthy low carbohydrate, both groups reduced their calories by about 500 to 600 calories per day on average from their baseline. So they initiated a calorie deficit, believe it or not. Like that's how they lost the weight. So they were in a calorie deficit, and both groups were able to do that regardless of whether it was healthy low fat or healthy low carbohydrate, which is obviously quite cool. And one of the big things in the study as well was that they were, really encouraged to maintain a nutrient-dense whole food diet. So regardless of whether they were in that healthy low fat group or the healthy low carbohydrate group, they were encouraged to eat a minimally processed whole food diet. And that's obviously something that we encourage a lot of the time. So, what you can take away from that is that from a weight loss perspective, regardless of whether you are going for the low fat approach or the low carbohydrate approach, you're going to do pretty well provided you maintain that minimally processed whole food diet. Okay, so that was the pretty cool thing about the study in relation to weight loss. Now, as we move to the genetic predisposition thing, again, there was no significant difference or significant relationship between the 3 SNPs that they predicted would lead to better outcomes in healthy low fat or healthy low carbohydrate group. So when they did that analysis afterwards, they didn't really find that relationship that they thought might be there. And similarly, for the insulin, or the INS30 as they called it, that didn't predict it either. So again, they weren't the predictors of who did well and who didn't do well. So neither of those things led to, the outcomes when it comes to weight loss. So while those things may be worth considering, and maybe they'll evolve further in future research as we begin to learn more, what we can take away now is that you can do pretty well on a healthy low fat diet or a healthy low carbohydrate diet, provided you are maintaining that minimally processed whole food approach. Okay, so we can see from this study that calories do matter. And the cool thing was that, the subjects were not instructed to reduce calories. It wasn't something they were instructed to do. They were given healthy eating advice. They were instructed to reduce, their intake of like high sugar foods and highly processed foods and things like that. And obviously that's quite good advice and stuff that we say a lot of the time. But they still reduced their calorie intake without tracking calories. So they weren't tracking their carbohydrates, they weren't tracking their fats. They were simply going off a food-based approach, education provided by dietitians. So that was a really cool thing for me. In terms of like health outcomes, again, like blood pressure, blood glucose, things like that, pretty much the same between groups. The only differences that were seen was in relation to blood lipids. So in the healthy low carbohydrate group, who would have had a higher fat intake obviously, they saw greater increases in LDL or low density lipoprotein. So that's typically going to be the type of cholesterol that they refer to as bad cholesterol. We're not going to get into this in this discussion because again, I'm just presenting the results to you and you can kind of make your decisions. So there was a 5% increase versus the low fat group in LDL cholesterol, but there was also a 5% increase in HDL cholesterol, so high density lipoprotein, which is the good cholesterol, in that group, in that healthy low carbohydrate group. So, higher HDL is generally considered to be a good thing, but higher LDL is generally considered to be a bad thing. But you do actually have to kind of look at it a bit more in context, because there's it's not just as simple as saying LDL. You have to look at particle number and all this stuff. But if we look at triglycerides, there was also a 15% decrease in triglycerides in the healthy low carbohydrate group. So again, that could be something you could be looking at as beneficial. But again, these are just the results, and the main thing I'm looking at here is the actual weight loss, because we see a lot of things in the fitness industry in relation to, low fat is better, low carbohydrate is better. And as we say at Triage all the time, it's really about eating a calorie appropriate diet that is made up of minimally processed, whole, nutrient dense foods, because that's kind of the thing that matters most. So that's what you guys can take away from this in relation to weight loss. Now, it's not to say that you should just choose whatever you want, because obviously carbohydrates are going to be very beneficial for your performance. And they instructed in the study to go down to 20 grams of fat if they could, and that's not something we'd recommend either, because again, fat has vital roles in the body. So we don't have to go to extremes. We just have to know that it is kind of the calories, and it is kind of eating nutrient dense foods that leads you to having really, really good outcomes. And there was one final thing that I wanted to mention. So interestingly, this study was funded by NUSI, and that's the Nutritional Science Institute, and that is something that has been set up by Gary Taubes and Peter Attia, as far as I'm aware. And both of those have I'm going to say Gary Taubes in particular, has a very strong bias towards low carbohydrate dieting. Okay, so like it's just funny to see that people who have such dogmatic views towards the whole low carb thing, the studies they're funding are showing that these differences that they're shouting about don't even exist. Okay, and that's not the first time that some of Gary Taubes' research has shown to go against what he says. And Gary Taubes has also said that he is not willing to accept research that goes against what he believes. He has explicitly said that when debating Alan Aragon. But anyway, that's for another time. But it just goes to show you that research isn't always, like, researchers can still have their own bias, and it's not always enough to just believe what they think, but we can put good faith in decent quality studies like this one, where they did have control for a lot of things and ran it over a long period of time, i.e. 12 months. So hopefully that gives you somewhat of an insight into what went on in this study. And if you guys have any further questions, feel free to drop them in the comments.